Now, while the 1850s is when everything began to go wrong, the 1860s is when things got even worse. The Whigs had already collapsed as a national party in 1854, and while the Republicans had absorbed most Northern Whigs, um, Southern Whigs really had nowhere in particular to go, most being unwilling to vote Democratic, but many not really feeling there was a place for them in the Republican Party. The Democrats had tried to remain a national party throughout the 1850s. The two presidents they elected in the 1850s, handsome Frank Pierce and James Buchanan, were both Northerners who supported the South, a type of politician known as a doughface in the 1850s. And much the same really might have been said for the last Whig president, Millard Fillmore, who took over after the death of Zachary Taylor in 1850. In 1860, though, the Democrats were no longer able to remain a national party, as the Democratic establishment, you might say, supported Stephen Douglas, a senator from Illinois who had proposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the idea of popular sovereignty, which did open Kansas and Nebraska to the possibility of the inhabitants voting to allow slavery in those territories and later states. But when Kansas actually created a pro-slavery constitution, Douglas did not support it because he believed, almost certainly correctly, that the legislature who created it had been fraudulently elected. And so Southerners were angry that Douglas had not supported the expansion of slavery into Kansas. And so the Democratic Convention fell apart in 1860, with Southerners walking out and holding their own convention not long afterwards and nominating John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, a future Confederate general, as the Southern Democratic candidate, whereas Northern Democrats also met in a second convention and did nominate Stephen Douglas, who, of all the candidates, probably did most appeal to all parts of the country, but that ultimately diluted his political power. He would come in second in the popular vote, but fourth in the electoral vote, because there would be four parties in 1860. The Northern and Southern Democrats, of course the Republicans, nominated Abraham Lincoln, who, although he was not many people's first choice, was acceptable as a second choice to almost all Republicans, being famous enough to attract national attention, but not having been involved in politics at the national level long enough to have made many significant enemies or taken any really strong controversial stance, indeed promising not to interfere with slavery where it already existed and was protected by the Constitution, although pledging to prevent it spreading any further west. And he had obviously the support of many Northerners, although many Northerners did vote for Stephen Douglas. On the other hand, Lincoln was not even on the ballot in most Southern states. Southerners, who were not Democrats, had to find something to do and ultimately created the Constitutional Union Party, nominating John Bell of Tennessee in a very narrow vote over Sam Houston of Texas. And they pledged to support the Constitution, which did, of course, include protections for slavery, but wanting to hold the Union together, and did choose a Northerner as the vice presidential candidate. Now, in the election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln won, obviously, despite getting just under 40% of the popular vote. But his vote was so concentrated in the more populous North that he overwhelmingly won the Electoral College, in getting a majority of the votes in the Electoral College, more than all three of his opponents combined. And so some have argued that had all of Lincoln's opponents worked together, then whichever of them was actually the candidate, would have won the election. But people have analyzed voting turnout county by county, and the Republicans still would have won enough counties and enough places to have won the Electoral College, even under those circumstances. Although certainly, had there been only one candidate, that might have changed other things as well. So Lincoln won the election without any significant Southern support. And while he promised not to interfere with slavery where it existed, many Southerners were not sure they could trust Honest Abe. Or even, if Lincoln stood by that promise, the fact the North could elect a candidate with no Southern support worried Southerners that some future Republican, Henry Seward perhaps, or Salmon P. Chase, might try to abolish slavery completely at some point in the future. And so some Southerners, feeling their way of life, the basis of their economy, was under attack, seceded from the Union. Indeed, in the long period, the 4 months between Lincoln's election and his inauguration, which in those days was on March 4th, 7 Southern states, beginning with South Carolina, left the Union and formed the Confederate States of America. This did mean that 8 slave-owning states remained in the Union. And once Lincoln became president, he hoped to retain those states, but knew it would be difficult, especially if he seemed like the aggressor. And so, while he had criticized President Polk for provoking the Mexican War by sending American troops into disputed territory, Lincoln insisted on maintaining the U.S. Army's presence in Fort Sumter in the midst of Charleston Harbor, which the South felt it could not abide. So that, while Fort Sumter would probably have surrendered due to starvation, had the South simply waited a bit longer, the Southern government, after some debate, decided to attack Fort Sumter and force Union forces there to surrender, which they did in April of 1861. So the South fired the first shots in what became the Civil War. The North was infuriated. Lincoln called for volunteers to put down the rebellion. In response, 4 more Southern states left the Union, although still leaving 4 slave-owning states in the Union. In Western Virginia, people were so unhappy that Virginia had left the Union, they left Virginia, forming the state of West Virginia. There are attempts to do similar things in East Tennessee and elsewhere, those, of course, being unsuccessful. It would be easy to spend an episode or many episodes on the Civil War, so instead we won't discuss it much, except to say that obviously the North won, predominantly because the North simply had so many material advantages, about 3 times the population the South had, about 9 times as much industrial capacity, more and better railroads, better transportation in general. While many Army officers resigned from the U.S. Army and became leaders of the Confederate Army, most of the Navy remained loyal to the Union and was able to blockade the South, which depended on the export of cotton for much of its economy and had expected to import many of the weapons that it needed. And it did get many weapons from Britain and France and elsewhere. And there was quite a bit of support for the South in much of Europe, particularly Britain and France. But ultimately, they chose not to recognize the South or openly support the Confederacy because of the unpopularity of slavery in those countries. And while the war was fought over many reasons, states' rights, tariffs, partisan politics, had it not been for slavery, those other issues would not have been so important and so destructive to the nation. So while you can make a good case the war was not about slavery, the fact is all the points that did lead to the war had in some way slavery behind them. And while Lincoln originally said he was not fighting to end slavery, that if he could save the Union without freeing any slaves, he would, he also said if he could save the Union by freeing some slaves or freeing all the slaves, he would do that. And following the strategic victory, if a tactical draw, in the Battle of Antietam, or Sharpsburg to Southerners, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, pledging to free slaves in rebellious areas, and thus making it a war about ending slavery, changing its character both at home and possibly most importantly, changing its character abroad. And so ultimately, with overwhelming manpower, overwhelming supplies, in terms of weapons, other manufactured goods, and also food, because while the South was heavily agricultural, It was primarily producing cotton, which really you should not eat. Although I've had a number of students in the past eat cotton to prove that you can, but I think they all regretted it. The end of the Civil War was marked by tragedy. Obviously, the death of 600 or 700,000 Americans, at least 2% of the country's population, was a horrible tragedy. And of course, near the end of the war came the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, a tragedy for the North, but also for the South, as Lincoln would probably have pursued a fairly moderate plan to bring Southern states back into the Union. Although perhaps not as lenient as he would have followed had Southern states come back voluntarily earlier than 1865, when the war did come to a conclusion with a full Union victory. But with Lincoln gone, he was replaced by his second vice president, Andrew Johnson, who was not a Republican. To win the election in 1864, Lincoln chose to officially run as the candidate of the Union Party, supported by Republicans, but also by war Democrats. Democrats who felt the war had to be won, in contrast to peace Democrats who want an end to the fighting, even if that meant perhaps recognizing Southern independence. And Lincoln chose as his Union Party vice president Andrew Johnson of Tennessee, the only Southern senator who had remained loyal after his home state seceded from the Union. And he had a fairly long and impressive career as a politician. He had been an alderman and mayor in Greenville. He'd been a pretty good governor of Tennessee in the 1850s before moving on to the Senate. When Nashville was conquered by the Union Army, he was made military governor of Tennessee. But once he became president, he felt he needed to protect the South from too much change enforced by the North. It is true that as a poor East Tennessean, he resented the Southern upper class, but he also resented the possibility of the North forcing significant change on the South. He tried to bring Southern states back into the Union quickly, but Republicans in Congress did not want to see former rebels right back in the House and the Senate, and refused to seat many of them. And after a long power struggle, Congress began a radical or military reconstruction of the South, officially abolishing and completely occupying 10 of the 11 Confederate states, Tennessee officially escaping this reconstruction by ratifying the 14th Amendment, guaranteeing citizenship to all races as long as you're born within the United States. But Tennessee still had a pretty hard time under our own governor, Parson William Brownlow. Johnson was eventually impeached, although not convicted. And really, the politics for the remainder of the 1860s would be determined by the Civil War. People would remember to vote as you shot. And so, for many Northerners, particularly Union Army veterans, it was imperative to vote Republican, viewing the Democrats as a party of traitors. Democrats, in turn, were found throughout the South. The South became solidly Democratic for about a century, as no Southerners outside East Tennessee were willing to vote for the party of Lincoln. And the two parties sorted out into several ways. African Americans gained the right to vote, first under military rule in the South, and then nationwide with the 15th Amendment. And where African Americans could vote, they consistently voted for the party of Lincoln, supporting the Republican Party for decades, if they could vote at all, as their vote was often suppressed in the South and sometimes elsewhere. Although while the military occupied the South, they did their best to make sure that black men could vote, knowing they would vote Republican, and often prevented white Southerners from voting on the grounds that they had engaged in treason during the Civil War. In response to that, the Ku Klux Klan and other groups used violence and the threat of violence to keep black Southerners from voting. For a time, I'm not sure anyone voted in the South. But when military Reconstruction came to an end, and the South became completely Democratic. Get outside East Tennessee, where many people were unwilling to vote for the party of Andrew Jackson. In some ways, at the national level, the parties would not seem that different. It would be a time, in some ways, of political stasis. The presidents of the late 1800s would be fairly weak. Congress would be more powerful. And there would be some deadlock. Every president but one elected for the rest of the 1800s would be a Civil War veteran, a Union veteran. Indeed, campaigning on your war record was referred to as waving the bloody shirt, and was very successful. Again, the winners of the war winning the presidency, and for the rest of the century, with one exception. And really, for 72 years, from 1860 to 1932, well into the fourth two-party system. On the other hand, while Republicans could dominate the Electoral College, their dominance of the North, the Democrats were a more nationwide party and often controlled the House of Representatives. Again, the presidency had been weakened by the impeachment of Andrew Johnson and generally a series of presidents who were not interested in strongly enforcing their will. Now, during this period, the most obvious difference between the Republicans and the Democrats was that the Republicans favored a very high tariff to protect industry. This was felt to benefit both business owners, but also their employees, as a high tariff would let factory owners charge high prices, but also let factory workers command high wages. And for a time, this was probably true. And so both factory owners and factory workers tended to support the Republicans. Farmers did tend to be split. Of course, Southern farmers voted Democratic. Many Midwestern farmers voted Democratic, as the Republicans were seen as being more the party of the Eastern business interests due to the Whig heritage that they inherited. On the other hand, the Republicans had also encompassed the Free Soil Party, which had promoted the settlement of the West by small independent farmers, and had, during the Civil War, passed the Homestead Act to sell Western land very cheap, had passed the Pacific Railway Act to build the Transcontinental Railroad and allow people to flood into the West. So, many farmers voted Republican out West. Furthermore, the Republicans inherited kind of the Christian moral reforming tradition of the anti-Masonic Party, who had become part of the Whigs. And so, many rural folks, especially in the West, supported the Republicans on moral grounds, what today might be called social issues. In particular, many rural people, both Republican and Democratic, supported temperance to limit or completely ban alcohol. Many urban Republicans supported this as well. Many urban Democrats were opposed to temperance. For one thing, many urban Democrats were immigrants from European countries where alcohol was more socially acceptable. Ask an Irishman or a German or a Polish immigrant not to drink and see how that goes. Furthermore, many of these urban immigrants were Catholic, who were resented by many rural Protestant voters. And this would be a split within the Democratic Party between their rural and urban votes throughout this third two-party system, and even into the fourth. On the other hand, there were some splits among the Republicans as well. And as the Eastern urban interests became more conservative, more business-oriented, and moved away from the Whig interest in an active government. Whereas Western Republicans retained the idea that the government ought to promote certain issues. In the government that had built the transcontinental railroad, they felt, should continue to help farmers in hard times. The Democrats, too, were split, many holding to the traditional Jeffersonian value that government that governs best governs least, whereas others, and especially farmers facing hard times after the Panic of 1873 and especially the Panic of 1893, began wanting the government to do more as well. Whereas the only Democratic president at the time, Grover Cleveland, supported a pretty conservative economic policy, at least. And one of the other divisive issues by the late 1800s, besides the tariff, high for Republicans and low for Democrats, was the basis of our currency. The United States had adopted the gold standard in 1873, requiring all dollars to be minted from or backed by gold. Most other countries around the world did the same thing. This was unpopular with many farmers who were often in debt and wanted more money in circulation to make it easier to pay off their debts. Likewise, Western silver miners were angry that their silver was no longer being minted freely into unlimited silver dollars. And it was a real problem to have a very limited supply of money. The economy was growing and the money supply was not, creating deflation in the late 1800s, which was a hardship for many people. And so, many Westerners, both Republican and Democratic, began to support increased coinage of silver. Some even wanted to produce paper money, as had been done during the Civil War. And others, farmers and working class Americans, and even some middle class Americans who began to see big business becoming too powerful and limiting their opportunities, began to demand change. There was a growing demand for reform in the late 1800s. And this split the Democratic Party noticeably, and the Republican Party some, as some primarily Western reformers formed the People's or Populist Party to demand the government help farmers and working class people in need, in particular through free silver, again freely minting unlimited quantities of silver into dollars again. But the gold bugs, more financially conservative Democrats and most Republicans, supported the gold standard, which split the Democrats completely in 1896 when they nominated the young pro-silver William Jennings Bryan, who attracted the votes of many populists and the attention of the whole country by becoming the first president to actively campaign across the United States. His opponent, William McKinley, a Civil War veteran from Ohio, campaigned from his front porch, encouraging prominent people to come and hear him give speeches on a regular basis, but he did not leave his hometown, both out of concern for his wife's health and because that seemed undignified. And William Jennings Bryan's campaign, telling Americans they must not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns, must not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold, while impressive, was unsuccessful, as William McKinley defeated him in 1896 and again in 1900. In maintaining a high tariff, a gold standard, and the dominance of a Republican Party whose supporters would vote as they shot. Against the Democrats, were seen as the party of rum, Romanism, and rebellion, drunk Catholic traitors, as one Republican candidate put it in 1884, although going too far in that year and alienating many people, contributing to the loss of James G. Blaine, the only Republican to lose completely in this period. But things were changing. And there were people who wanted to reform, including a growing middle class of both Republicans and Democrats who believed there was a need for change, for the government to take a more active role, to clean up corruption, in particular to limit the powers of the big businesses, of monopolies and cartels that reduced or cut out competition, letting them jack up prices, forget about consumer safety, and also preventing a growing middle class from rising to become captains of industry themselves, as had been the American dream of a past generation. And these people who believed reform, progress, could be created through government action came to be known as progressives. And it would be they who would define, both through their actions and the opposition to their actions, a fourth two-party system, but one that will gain the presidency not through election, but through assassination, as William McKinley would be assassinated shortly after being reelected in the election of 1900, being shot in the late summer of 1901. And when this happened, his new vice president would replace him. The Republicans had won in 1900, as Republicans always won, with a Civil War veteran from Ohio and a vice president from New York, those being populist swing states. But this time, the vice president was different from his first term vice president, who had died, this being a young reformer named Theodore Roosevelt, who was selected for the vice presidency by the machine politicians of New York, who wanted to get him out of the picture, because they believed once he was in the vice presidency, he would never be heard from again.